The gray, low sky over the snow-covered field near Ivanovo seemed not just an atmospheric phenomenon, but a heavy lead lid, pressing all living things to the frozen ground. The wind here didn't blow, it bit, penetrating layers of clothing, finding the slightest crack to sting with an icy needle. On the runway, which was simply snow rolled flat by rollers, a small, predatory machine trembled with tension. The Yak-1 fighter, with a tricolor circle on its fuselage, resembled a beast ready to pounce. In the cockpit, a man whose breath escaped in clouds of vapor sat, clutching the control stick in his gloved hands. Just 6 months ago he was drinking coffee on a sunny terrace in North Africa, or strolling through the streets of London. And now, thousands of kilometers from everything familiar, he was preparing to enter battle in the skies of a foreign, mysterious, and frightening country. Below, at the wing, a figure in a thick, shapeless quilted jacket bustled. The Soviet mechanic, his face covered in soot and oil, shouted something, trying to overpower the engine's roar, and gestured towards the horizon. The French pilot nodded. At that moment, an invisible thread emerged between them, between the aristocrat raised on French literature and the simple man from the Russian hinterland. A thread that was stronger than the steel control cables of the plane. This was the beginning of a story that would overturn perceptions of war, alliance, and the human spirit. A story where the cold of metal met the warmth of hearts, and language barriers crumbled under the onslaught of shared misfortune. To fully grasp the incredible nature of this moment, one must go back to the hour when France plunged into darkness. 1940 became a year of national mourning and humiliation. Paris fell, the government signed an armistice, and the proud republic found itself fractured. But in London, in cramped offices, General Charles de Gaulle waged his own war. He understood one simple but cruel truth. For France to sit at the victor's table after the war, she must shed blood in that war. He needed not just partisans in the forests, he needed a regular army fighting on the main theater of war. And the main theater at that moment was in the East, where the Soviet Union alone was grinding down the best divisions of the Wehrmacht. The decision to send French pilots to Russia was a bold geopolitical move. It was a signal to the whole world. Quote, "Zero is not a myth. It is a real force." Negotiations were difficult. Stalin was skeptical of the idea, and the Allies in London and Washington jealously watched the rapprochement between the French and the Communists. But de Gaulle's will and the pragmatism of the Soviet command prevailed. In September 1942, a group of volunteers began their long journey. This was a true journey of 20th-century Argonauts. They traveled a complex, winding route through Nigeria, Egypt, Palestine, Iran. Every kilometer took them further from their familiar world and closer to the unknown. When, in late November 1942, transport planes landed at Severny Airfield in Ivanovo, the French experienced cultural and climatic shock. The thermometer showed -20 degrees, and this was only the beginning of winter. They were met by stern people who didn't smile without reason, and a way of life devoid of the slightest hint of European comfort. The first choice they had to make determined the entire future fate of the regiment. The Soviet command, showing respect for their guests, offered them a choice of any equipment supplied under Lend-Lease. Reliable American _, _0 powerful English _, _1 But Major Jean Toulazny, the first commander of the group, after several test flights, made a historic decision. "2," he said. This decision caused surprise but also immense respect among the Russians. To choose a Soviet aircraft meant to share the fate of a Soviet pilot, to entrust one's life to technology created in this country. The Yak was a light, maneuverable, wooden fighter that demanded virtuoso skill from the pilot. But in close combat, it surpassed many Western counterparts. Exhausting training began. The French had to relearn everything. Western air combat tactics were based on pairs and clear echeloning, on maintaining formation. In the skies of Russia, the chaos of a dogfight reigned. Battles here were fought at low altitudes. They were fleeting, brutal, and massive. Russian instructors taught them, "Look 360 degrees. If you don't turn your head, you're already shot down." The language barrier was overcome with gestures, drawings in the snow, and an incredible mix of French and Russian expletives. It was during these days that the unique phenomenon that would later be called the Normandy Brotherhood began to emerge. The regiment consisted of people who, in peaceful life, would never have found themselves at the same table. There were hereditary nobles, viscounts and counts whose ancestors had served French kings. Next to them in the mess hall sat staunch communists, workers who dreamed of social justice. Roland de la Puippe, an aristocrat to the core, flew in the same flight as Marcel Albert, the son of a simple worker. Internal tension, political disputes, all this could tear the unit apart from within. But the harsh reality of the Russian winter and a common goal forged them into a single monolith. There were no counts and proletarians here. There were only pilots whose lives depended on whether their wingman would cover their tail in combat. But the deepest and most touching layer of this story was the relationship between the pilots and their Soviet mechanics. Each aircraft had a technician assigned to it, a Russian guy, often very young, whose hands were perpetually black with oil and whose face was weathered by frosts. Initially, the French regarded them with distrust. The difference in mentalities seemed insurmountable. A French pilot was accustomed to a mechanic being service personnel, an invisible shadow. A Russian mechanic considered the aircraft his own, and the pilot as someone to whom he entrusted his precious machine. A miracle of human connection occurred. The mechanics, seeing how cold the French were, began to sew warm covers for them, somehow scrounging up extra rations and heating water for washing. In severe frosts, when the oil in the engines turned into thick tar, the mechanics did not retreat to warm dugouts. They slept under the wings of the aircraft, covered with tarpaulins, warming the engines every 2 hours so that in the morning, at the first signal rocket, the Frenchmen could take off. They warmed the engines with their own body heat, sometimes literally embracing the cold metal. When a pilot returned from battle, soaked with sweat, with shaking hands, the first person he saw was his mechanic. And in the eyes of the Russian guy, a silent question could be read. "How's the machine? How are you yourself?" Gradually, the pilots began to understand. These men in padded jackets were their guardian angels. Rituals emerged. The Frenchman shared his chocolate ration or cigarettes with the mechanic, and the mechanic taught the Frenchman complex Russian idioms and how to drink vodka properly without burning one's throat. It was a clash of two worlds that ended not in an explosion, but in an embrace. Soviet propaganda loved to talk about internationalism, but here, at the field airfield, it existed not on posters, but in reality, in oily rags, in a shared bowl of porridge, in a piercing gaze when the aircraft disappeared into the clouds. In the spring of 1943, the regiment went to the front. Illusions dissipated in the very first serious battle. Air warfare was not a nightly tournament. It was a hard, dirty job of destruction. The Germans, experienced Luftwaffe aces, quickly realized that they were fighting not novices, but motivated professionals. French speech was heard on the air, and this infuriated the enemy. The German command issued an order. Do not take Frenchmen prisoner. Shoot them on the spot if they make an emergency landing. For a downed _2_ aircraft, German pilots were given double awards and leave. This was recognition. Recognition that they had become a dangerous force. The Battle of Kursk in the summer of 1943 became a baptism of fire and steel. The sky over Orel and Kursk resembled a boiling cauldron. Hundreds of aircraft converged in a deadly tangle. The horizon disappeared in the smoke of burning tanks and villages. The French made 3, 4, sometimes 5 sorties a day. The physical strain was extreme. Overloads pressed the body into the seat, eyes darkened. But one had to turn one's head, search for a target, and evade tracers. It was then that the true nature of their sacrifice became apparent. They were dying. Young, handsome, hopeful lads were dying. Jean Toulasne, their commander, did not return from battle in July. His plane simply dissolved into the sky, leaving not even wreckage for a grave. The loss of their commander could have broken their spirit, but the effect was the opposite. A cold, calculated rage settled in the hearts of the pilots. They ceased to be mere soldiers following orders. They became avengers. They avenged Toulasne, Litolf, and everyone whose place at the dinner table was empty in the evening. During those days, an important transformation occurred. They saw liberated Russian villages. They saw what the occupiers left behind: gallows, burnt houses, weeping women. The abstract struggle for the freedom of France gained a concrete face, the face of an old Russian woman who crossed herself as their planes flew over the roofs. They understood that they were defending not just an ally, but the very right of people to live. "I fight for Paris by defending Moscow," one of the pilots wrote in a letter home. This phrase became the quintessence of their philosophy. In 1944, the regiment received the honorary title Neman for covering troops during the crossing of that river. Now they were officially called Normandie-Neman. The double name sounded like a symbol of a double identity. They were sons of France and heroes of Russia simultaneously. The aircraft fleet was updated. They received the latest Yak-3s. These were perfect machines for low altitudes, light as a feather, and fast as lightning. On these planes, the aces of the regiment performed true miracles. Marcel Albert, who became one of the most effective pilots, said that the Yak-3 allowed them to do things in the air that seemed physically impossible. In the autumn of 1944, the war approached the borders of the Reich. The battles in East Prussia were particularly fierce. The enemy was cornered and fought with the desperation of the doomed. The density of anti-aircraft fire was such that the sky seemed black with explosions. Losses grew. One day, the regiment lost several crews at once. In the evening, silence reigned in the officers' mess, broken only by the clinking of cutlery. But the next morning, those who remained went back to their planes. Mechanics, weeping, saw them off, understanding that statistics were relentless. The chances of surviving this meat grinder dwindled with each passing day. But they survived. And they won. In the skies over Königsberg and Pillau, the French pilots put the final touch on their combat epic. They cleared the sky for Soviet bombers, ensuring the capture of the impregnable fortress. When Germany's surrender was announced on May 9, 1945, there was not only jubilation, but also desolation in the regiment. Too many had not lived to see that morning. 42 French pilots remained forever lying in Soviet soil. Their graves were scattered from Oriol to Königsberg, marking the regiment's path with crosses and stars. The results of their work impressed even the most stoic staff officers. 5,240 combat sorties, 869 aerial battles, 273 officially confirmed victories, and dozens more enemy aircraft damaged and destroyed on the ground. But the numbers could not convey the main thing, the moral significance of their presence. For the Soviet soldier in the trench, the sight of a French fighter overhead was a sign that the world had not forgotten him, that Europe was fighting shoulder to shoulder with him. In June 1945, an event occurred that had no analogue in diplomatic history. Joseph Stalin, wishing to express the highest degree of gratitude, signed a decree. The regiment returns to its homeland with weapons in hand. Their aircraft were given to them, 40 Yak-3 fighters, combat machines that had been through fire and water, became the property of France. This was a gesture of incredible symbolic power. Usually, weapons are surrendered after a war, but here, weapons became a reward. The farewell to the mechanics was the hardest part of the departure. At Elbing Airfield there was a hum, but not from engines, but from voices. Russian lads and French officers embraced, not ashamed of their tears. They exchanged addresses, knowing that, most likely, the Iron Curtain would soon fall, and letters would not reach their destination. They gave each other watches, lighters, photographs, anything that could preserve memory. Mechanic Volodya gave pilot Francois his penknife, and in return, the pilot handed him his flight goggles. At that moment, there was no ideology, no politics. There were only people who had been through hell and become brothers. "Don't forget me, friend," was heard in broken Russian and broken French. On June 15th, an armada of fighters soared into the sky and set course for the west. They flew over Europe, which was still smoking with ruins, but was already beginning to breathe peace. Intermediate landings in Prague, Stuttgart, and finally, Paris, Le Bourget Airfield. Thousands of people came to meet the heroes. When the wheels touched French soil, when the pilots cut the engines and opened their cockpit canopies, they were deafened by the roar of the crowd. They were carried on shoulders, showered with flowers. But many noticed a strangeness. Upon getting out of their cockpits, the pilots did not first run to their families, but stroked their planes, as if saying goodbye to them, and through them, to those who had prepared these machines for flight there, in the distant east. The story could have ended there, becoming a beautiful legend for textbooks. But its resonance turned out to be much deeper. During the Cold War, when the world was on the brink of nuclear catastrophe, the memory of Normandie-Niemen remained that thin bridge that connected the two warring superpowers. French veterans came to the USSR, Soviet mechanics, who had become gray-haired grandfathers, traveled to France. Their meetings were filled with such warmth that it melted the ice of official protocols. They showed that human connections are stronger than political constructs. Today, as we look at the events of those years through the prism of time, the history of the Normandie-Neman Regiment offers us crucial lessons. It's a lesson that to unite people, it's not necessary to have identical views on how society should be structured. It's enough to share common values, dignity, courage, and a love for freedom. It's a lesson that mutual assistance is possible even in the most extreme conditions, if you peel away the husk of prejudice and see another human being in the other. The paradox of this story is that the strongest brotherhood between representatives of the capitalist West and the communist East arose precisely where ideology should have been paramount, in the army. But the sky purifies us of ideology. At 3,000 meters, there are no party cards, only the pilot's skill and the engine's reliability. The Normandy pilots proved that patriotism knows no bounds. Fighting for Russia, they saved the honor of France. And Soviet mechanics, saving French pilots, defended their own land. Now, imagine the final scene, an aviation museum, present day. An old but perfectly restored Yak-3 stands in the center of the hall. Beside it stands a small boy who gazes with delight at the red star and white arrow on its fuselage. His grandfather, leaning on a cane, quietly tells him the story. He doesn't speak of strategy and tactics. He doesn't rattle off dates. He tells how one winter, at -30 degrees, a Russian guy named Ivan took off his mittens and gave them to a French pilot, because the Frenchman had lost his gloves and had to fly. And in this simple gesture, passed down through generations, lies the entire essence, the entire truth, and the entire grandeur of the Normandie-Neman regiment's history. The airplane is frozen in the museum, but the flight continues. It continues in memory, which, like that yak, requires careful upkeep and constant attention so as not to rust and disappear into the fog of oblivion. In a world once again full of strife, this symbol of unity shines brighter than any guiding star, reminding us of what people are capable of when they decide to stand together against the darkness.